All right, why don't we get started? Welcome everyone to the first Faculty Works in Progress series that's associated with our Global Fellows program. The theme for this year is unsettling, and what we're going to be doing over the next, I think, 3 sessions of Faculty Works in Progress series is hosting our fellows and the work that they've been doing over the course of this academic year. So we're going to have our first group go today. So I'll introduce them briefly in the order that they're going to go, and then probably have about, I'd say, like around 15 minutes, maybe a little bit less, from each of our presenters, and then we'll have the opportunity to ask questions. So first of all, I wanted to introduce Judith Bishop, who's Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies on the Oakland campus. Presentation that Judith is going to be giving today is called Early Deaf Education and the Deafhood Movement and Unsettling Discourses. And then we're going to go next, Sophie Toff, who's a Political and International Relations PhD candidate on the London campus, who's going to be talking about biopolitics of the climate crisis. And then we'll end here with Nick Brown, who's Associate Teaching Professor of Urban Landscape and History in the Boston campus. And the talk will be called Trail Relations, an Unorthodox Guide to the Pacific Crest Trail. So join me in welcoming all of our speakers before we... and Judith, if you feel like you can take it away at this point.
Okay. Thank you. I'm excited to be here. So let me start with, what are my main arguments? Number one, language for the deaf is a global, and global deaf communities has been a very contested area. Number two, changes in the 19th century deaf education had more to do with understandings of what it means to be human, to be a person, than what it means to be deaf or hearing. Number three, settler colonialism is a useful tool for examining the losses associated with those changes in the 19th and 20th century deaf educational institutions. So if I run out of time, in, my 3 main points, and we've got it. Okay. Recent years have seen an explosive growth in both scholarship and grassroots organization around deaf identity, the most focused of which is the Deafhood movement, first posited by Dr. Patty Ladd, a deaf scholar at the University of Bristol. Deafhood is an international movement which articulates deaf cultures and positions deaf communities alongside similar minority cultures and multilingual discourses. The Deafhood movement stands in opposition to the medical concept of deafness, which defines deaf communities by their perceived lack, specifically a lack of connection to auditory languages. Deafhood instead looks to theorists in colonial and cultural studies, particularly Bakhtin, Said, Baba, Spivak, to argue a deaf ethnicity resting on a common distinctive linguistic identity, signed languages, a shared epistemological foundation which privileges sight as the primary means of knowledge and orientation, and the experiences of marginalization resulting from colonialism as signed language peoples. In the eyes of many hearing people, deaf people appear incomplete because of the lack of auditory connection to spoken languages, whereas for deaf persons themselves, deafness is asserts a state of being that reflects completeness. Other scholars and activists in the deaf community have drawn inspiration from the experience and writings of Indigenous scholars writing against settler colonialism, particularly those of the Americas. The history of deaf education bears similarities to the Native American boarding school attempts to assimilate children and youth by separating them from adult members of the deaf community that provide socialization and linguistic access to community and culture. America first began educating its deaf children at the beginning of the 19th century. The first schools for the deaf were founded in Connecticut, New York, and Pennsylvania during 1840 to 1820. At the Connecticut school, the directors employed a deaf French educator, Lawrence Clerc, who brought the language of his former school in Paris to the American school. This language then commingled with the indigenous sign languages of the area and became the basis for American Sign Language that exists today in the United States. Depending on which linguist you talk to, American Sign Language is either 60 or 70% French Sign Language. It bears really no resemblance to British Sign Language. So the language migration map for the deaf world is quite different than for the hearing. For the most part, the presence of sign language in these early schools was not problematic. But by the middle of the 19th century, this sentiment began to shift. That shift betrays the nation's changing ideas about humans and their symbolic capacity. The mid and late 19th century moved from embracing sign language in residential schools for the deaf to aggressively suppressing it in favor of oralism only. As Baton argues, this shift was not so much driven by educational efficacy, but instead reflected broader cultural anxieties regarding normality, nationality, immigration, and the emergent influence of evolutionary thought. As such, the late 19th century experienced a major ideological shift from viewing sign language as a natural God-given tool for deaf education and deaf life to regarding sign language as savage and an unnatural barrier to civilization itself. This shift was driven by the rise of social Darwinism, a misappropriation of Darwin's scientific work, which equated Native American communities with an earlier stage of social development. It also equated manual communication in the deaf community, including American Sign Language, with a primitive pre-linguistic state of human development. The residential deaf schools had included teaching lip reading and speech from the mid-century on. However, oralism as an educational philosophy demanded that deaf people and deaf education adopt oral speech only, no sign language, in an effort to conform American normativity and national homogeneity. In addition to the social Darwinisms, U.S. culture was experiencing an unprecedented, the greatest influx of immigrants the United States had known. So foreignness was a metaphor of great significance for Americans in the late 19th century. The new waves of immigration were concentrated in urban areas, and no major city was without its surging pattern of immigrants communities. Many came from Eastern and Southern Europe, bringing with them cultural beliefs and habits that Americans born in the U.S. often regarded as peculiar, inferior, or even dangerous. A movement contemporary with and sharing many of the characteristics of the oralist movement in the deaf community would be the assimilation of the American Indians. In his classic study, A Final Promise, The Campaign to Assimilate the Indians, Frederick Hoxie has noted that in the late 19th century, there was a growing diversity and shrinking social spaces which threatened many Americans' sense of national identity. This resulted in calls for immigration restrictions, limits on employment of foreigners, and the prescription of language other than English in the schools. Sound familiar? Baton argues that under these circumstances, American Sign Language made the American deaf population seem foreign to their hearing companions. So American deaf suddenly became foreigners in their own country. This shift in attitude was driven by a move away from the earlier 19th century view of natural sign language as a understood speech away from natural sign language towards a view that understood speech as the only mark of civilized normal person. This led hearing educators to view sign language as a primitive, lower form of communication associated with savages or apes. Educators began advocating that only spoken language was reflected in civilized, higher level learning human thought and evolution. One of the strongest adherents to this philosophy was Alexander Graham Bell, both whose wife and mother were deaf. Though he did not advocate for the legal prohibition of intermarriage like many of his co-authors advocated that it should be illegal for the deaf to marry, he did strongly argue against deaf clubs and associations, deaf intermarriage, and the general concept of deaf culture and American Sign Language. Quote, "Those who believe as I do that the production of a defective race of human beings would be a great calamity will examine carefully the causes that lead to the intermarriage of the deaf with the object of applying a remedy." He also said, quote, "We should try ourselves to forget that they are deaf. We should try to teach them to forget that they are deaf." The tensions between these two philosophies, the manual method using signed languages along with speech and lip reading versus oralism, which was aggressively supported sign language, aggressively suppressed sign language, comes to a head in the 1880 Milan Conference for Teachers of the Deaf. Tucci, the president of the Royal Institute for the Deaf in Milan, started the season on September 6, 1880. He presented the results of an investigation which he claimed showed that, quote, "It is universally agreed among the instructors of the deaf that the manual alphabet and the use of signs will be no more. The spoken word will conquer. The spoken word is the privilege of man. It is the soul in certain vehicle of thought. It is the gift of God." The organizers designated the director of the Milan School for the Deaf, Guido Tara, as the president of the convention. During the opening remarks, Tara asked the delegates remember that, quote, "Oral speech is the sole power that can rekindle the light of God breathed into man." With the rise of oralism and the eventual banning of sidelining of ASL, American schools for the deaf were greatly weakened in their ability to transmit deaf culture and language to subsequent generations of deaf children and youth. They also experienced a severe drop in contact with deaf adults. In the early 19th century, we have about 40% of teachers in deaf schools are themselves deaf. By the time we came to the end of the 19th century, that was 17 to 18%. In a classic text, Education for Extinction, American Indians and the Boarding School Experience, David Wallace states, "Only when one understands reformers' assumptions and beliefs about the nature and fate of Indian America can one appreciate the full meaning of the educational programs they have designed." This brings to mind the famous phrase from the Carlisle Industrial School, "Kill the Indian to save the man," or as Adam puts it, a method of saving Indians by destroying them. I would argue that the same spirit informed changes in deaf education during what the deaf community call the century of oralism, approximately 1860 to 1960. I would also argue that the two movements were invigorated by similar cultural and intellectual factors, and with much the same result. Thank you.
Thanks, Judith. That was great. I'm sure I have questions. People have questions at the end. Sophie, did you want to go next?
Yes, I will try and share my screen, if that's okay. Are you seeing the main slides?
We
Yes.
were, and then there's this weird little authenticate window thing that has popped up. Can someone make that go? There we are. Beautiful.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah, I can see him in California.
Awesome.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for being here. As Getty said, I'm Sophie. I'm a third-year PhD student at the London campus. And today I wanted to share how my doctoral research engages directly with the theme of this year's fellowship programme by unsettling something we often take for granted, the category of the human in environmental governance. Ooh. Just to provide a brief overview of what I'm going to do today, I've structured this in 3 stages. So I'll first outline the analytical problem that my project addresses. I'll then provide an overview of my project and methodology, and then I'll outline the progress I've made during the fellowship. So, big news, the ecological crisis is profoundly unsettling. But it's actually unsettling in ways that we don't often acknowledge. Yes, it threatens life on Earth as we know it, but more fundamentally, it confronts us with the possibility that the categories that we treat as the most natural and stable might actually be the most constructed and destructive. The crisis forces us to question not just our policies or behaviours, but the very narratives we've been told for centuries about what it means to be human. The supposed superiority of man over anything considered natural, you could call this anthropocentrism, isn't just an outdated belief system, it's actively engineering the reality that's destroying the planet. And what I contend is our analytical tools are simply inadequate to understand how this destruction persists. Efforts to better understand human-nature relations typically begin by considering worldviews. And apologies, you probably can't see it's quite small text, but this is what is shown in the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It's a mouthful. IPBES recent methodological assessment, which maps the various values of nature. However, worldview frameworks have a critical limitation. They can't explain how or why the categories of human and nature constructed and persist in the first place. Why? I contend that it's because there's no conceptualization of power. Worldviews treat these categories, so human and nature, as pre-existing frameworks that organize our thinking as opposed to products of specific power relations. This gap is explicitly acknowledged by IPBES. They call for more research on how power relations influence ecology and knowledge production, noting, quote, power relations are crucial in determining which values and whose values dominate decision-making. And yet there's been a distinct lack of analysis examining how these power relations actually operate to produce and maintain the human nature binary. So this is the gap my research addresses in my project, Biopolitics of the Climate Crisis. I'm conducting a genealogical analysis of how the human has been manufactured as a subject category since 1938, which is the year when Guy Callender linked climate change to human activity. Specifically, I'm tracing what I'm calling the dispositif of the human. Now, a dispositif is essentially a network of power relations. It connects discourses, technologies, institutions, and practices that produce particular ways of being and knowing. In my context, this involves examining how humans have been positioned as subjects who actively engineer environmental reality, maintaining that human nature binary through evolving power relations. My analytical method mobilizes Foucauldian biopolitics with science and technology studies. So this means I'm examining not just discourses, but the material conditions of knowledge production, the technologies, institutions, scientific practices, and the implications of these. And critically, I assess existing power dynamics to understand how they've created the conditions for our contemporary approach to biodiversity governance and valuation. So while the bulk of my work is theoretical, I wanted to ensure that it was rooted in material realities, and as such, I ground my project empirically in the Convention on Biological Diversity and the associated work of IPBES. But why does this matter? Well, intellectually, it uncovers complex and deeply ingrained power relations that are involved in our current conservation efforts. Most environmental politics research focuses on policy effectiveness or climate justice. This is slightly different. It examines the underlying processes of subject formation that make certain policies thinkable and others unthinkable. As for why I'm focusing on the human, I want to go beyond this sort of more existential question of what it means to be human in the Anthropocene. That's been quite well covered. What I'm focused on is how being human in these times affects our approach to conserving the natural world in a very relational way. Because the way we conceptualize human subjectivity determines what conservation actions appear possible, desirable, or legitimate. Human exceptionalism structures governance even when we're explicitly acknowledging interconnection, and that's the puzzle I'm trying to explain. As for why biodiversity specifically, as opposed to climate change, I appreciate the title of my project might seem misleading. It's a point of contention. Well, there's two reasons for this. The first is that biodiversity allows for a much broader consideration of non-human life. It's not just about charismatic megafauna or ecosystem services, it's about all life forms. And secondly, there's a genuine lack of conceptualization of biodiversity in political theory. Climate change completely dominates the literature, while biodiversity loss is comparatively under-theorized, even though it's arguably an equally severe dimension of the ecological crisis. Biodiversity governance also crystallizes the tensions between acknowledging interconnection and maintaining human control in particularly clear ways. But I just want to take a moment to be clear about what worldviews can't do. Worldviews are static observational frameworks that require pre-existing subjects. They mechanically order subjects as opposed to produce them. They're composed of beliefs and values, but they can't account for how human-nature relationships are actively produced, maintained, and reproduced. By contrast, dispositive analysis is productive. It accounts for both discursive and non-discursive elements, so the material conditions, technologies, and institutions of our current condition, and it accommodates fluidity and dynamism. And that's why dispositive analysis provides a more productive framework for examining the constantly changing human-nature relations and answering the question of where power might be. But this isn't to say that worldviews aren't constitutive of how we understand our relationship with the natural world. Indeed, worldviews are one of 4 interconnected nodes I'm examining in my dispositive analysis. So these are worldviews, technology, science, and then combined institutionalization and biodiversity. And these aren't separate domains. They constitute a network that produces and maintains particular human subject positions. Each node will loosely structure a chapter in my thesis. And the dispositive of the human, more broadly, is that network of power relations that holds these nodes together. It's through the interactions between worldviews, technologies, scientific practices, and institutions that the human, as environmental manager, gets produced and reproduced. The dispositive of the human produces and maintains human exceptionalism by positioning humans as rational managers of the ecological systems they simultaneously inhabit and transcend. And this is sort of the core mechanism that I'm tracing throughout my dissertation. So fittingly, what I've just discussed, so my methodology, had been established before starting the fellowship, as had my analysis of worldviews and the development of the dispositive of the human. What's developed during my tenure so far has been 2 chapters or nodes, so those of science and technology. In my science chapter, I trace how new environmental disciplines or sciences since 1938 have acknowledged the human nature interconnection while simultaneously preserving human exceptionalism through enhanced management roles. So in summary, we can see in this from the calendar effect, where he linked human activity to climate change, there was a preservation of this idea of humans as a rational master of natural systems. We then move through to systems ecology, which we can see the creation of the ecosystem engineer. The International Biological Programme institutionalized the managerial ecologist, while contemporary sustainability science consolidates the idea of a sustainability coordinator. Each scientific development appears to recognize our ecological embeddedness, while actually reinforcing our exceptional position as managers, engineers, and overseers. I've recently completed the work on my technology chapter, and the argument I'm developing here is that technologies transformed the managerial rationality established in the environmental sciences into operational systems of control, and they did so through 3 distinct movements. And over the course of these movements, technologies produced the human as environmental manager. So I start with the dematerialization of information through cybernetics and systems thinking, which translated ecosystems into abstract and manageable data. I then move on to a discussion of the global and the visual. So here I talk about satellite observation, which positioned humans as planetary observers outside of the systems they study. And I culminate my consideration of technology with what I'm calling conservation triage, by which I mean the mobilization of technologies that enables calculation and prioritization of nature, positioning humans as the rational allocators of nature's value. And my goal through this is to really show an escalating logic. First, abstract nature into information, then scale up to see the whole planet, and then develop tools to decide what's worth saving when you recognize you can't save everything. And these decisions are only possible due to the commensurability that was established with the dematerialization phase and the global and visual phase. What the analysis shows is that humans are consistently represented as both systems components and system managers, embedded within nature yet positioned outside of it as rational engineers. And this is what I'm calling the post-human contradiction, and it's at the heart of contemporary environmental governance. Systems ecology recognizes humans as part of ecosystems, but positions us as ecosystem engineers. Satellite observation reveals the Earth is an integrated system which we inhabit, but positions us as planetary observers outside of that system, while conservation technologies acknowledge biodiversity's complexity, but give us enhanced capacity for rational triage and allocation. And this contradiction has profound implications. Analytically, it reveals why worldview analysis fails. It's not about conflicting beliefs. It's about power relations that produce subjects who can hold these contradictory positions simultaneously without cognitive dissonance. Politically, it explains the persistent failure of environmental governance. We can't solve the ecological crisis through better management because management itself reproduces the problem. It requires maintaining the separation between humans and nature that drives ecological destruction. And perhaps most unsettling, it suggests that even sort of transformative post-humanist and ecological frameworks claiming to dissolve human exceptionalism may actually inadvertently reinforce it by granting humans the capacity to recognize, theorize, and manage our embeddedness. My next phase will examine two questions. So how did biodiversity emerge as a subject requiring expert management in the first place? And how do contemporary governance frameworks mobilize or resist the dispositif of the human? And the intention here will be to tie together the discursive, scientific, and technological nodes through institutional analysis. What does all this mean? Well, my research demonstrates that the human nature divide is not simply a mistaken belief system that we can correct by changing our worldview. Rather, it's the strategic outcome of a complex network involving scientific institutions, technologies, governance frameworks, and economic systems that actively maintain human exceptionalism, all while appearing neutral and objective. This is deeply unsettling, but it's also potentially liberating. By demonstrating that human subjectivity and environmental reality are manufactured rather than natural, we open the possibility for unsettling these hierarchies and reimagining how life forms could be valued outside of anthropocentric logics. If the human, as environmental manager, is a historical construct produced through specific power relations, then it can just as well be deconstructed and reconstructed differently. So I want to thank you for your time. And I also want to take a moment to thank my wonderful cohort, who I don't think are here today, but they've made this a really rich experience. And also big thanks go to the CSSH team for the opportunity and the logistics for today.
Thanks, Sophie. That was wonderful. Nick?
Yeah. What does?
Did it once and it worked, so.
Did it once? My car broke down this weekend and I spent like 3 hours standing in the parking lot waiting for a tow truck, so I'm worried about
Oh dear.
jinxing the technology.
There we go.
Feel free to pause me so that we have time for questions. See. You all hear me all right on London and Oakland? Yep. Great. All right. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to jump right in. And what I'm going to share with you today is a very small slice of a very big project. So the Trail Relations and Unorthodox Guide to the Pacific Crest Trail is sort of the big project. And what I'm going to share is an attempt to contextualize the trail, the Pacific Crest Trail and trails in general in our present political moment. And so the piece is titled Closing Borders and Intruding Politics, a Pacific Crest Trail Story. And it's written sort of in an op-ed style and is snappy. Um, So in 1922, the planner and conservationist Benton Mackay asked some pointed questions about the Appalachian Trail, still just a nascent idea that he had proposed the previous year. We live in tough times, he observed. Nations are starving and new wars brewing. Class antagonisms are tightening. We approach a crossroads in history. Why plan trails in days like these? Why fiddle when Rome burns? For Mackay, the answers lie in the fact that the 2,200-mile Appalachian Trail was much more than a footpath in the woods. As he envisioned it, the trail was a new approach to, quote unquote, the problem of living in a vast and unique region. Keller Easterling describes Mackay's AT plan as a terrestrial infrastructure network that would reorganize the entire eastern seaboard. Why plan trails in days like these? Mackay's question reverberates loudly across the century. Honestly, I'm struggling to come up with adequate answers today. But as someone who thinks about trails expansively, as social and political infrastructure, as frameworks for organizing space and people, as much as anything else, it's a question that I keep coming back to, and one that grounds my own engagement with the Pacific Crest Trail on the West Coast. Why trails when Rome burns? Why trails when Minneapolis, Greenland, Venezuela, Gaza? Why trails when the PCT is literally on fire due to the accelerating climate crisis? For me, the best answers are found in the political nature of trails. I see this nature not as a liability, but as an opportunity, something to recognize and embrace. So the idea of, I'll be talking about, without naming them as such, power relations, basically, in the context of the PCT. On January 25th, 2025, just over 1 year ago, the Canada Border Services Agency abruptly ended the Pacific Crest Trail permit program. Information about the program disappeared from the agency's website, which you see here. A temporary page stated anyone seeking to complete the Canadian portion of the trail must use a designated port of entry. 2 days later, a news release offered an explanation. This change will facilitate monitoring of compliance of trail users, enhance security at the border, and aligns with the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, who does not allow travelers to enter the U.S. from Canada on the trail. Of course, the closure was in response to the threat of tariffs from the then new Trump administration. It was tit for tat. Canada was enhancing border security to appease an impetuous president and perhaps inflict a small measure of pain on its southern neighbors. I can't help but interpret the closure as part of a broader response to Trump's threats, including his farcical invitation to make Canada the 51st U.S. state. Stretching from Mexico to Canada, the 2,600-mile Pacific Crest Trail is one of 11 federally designated national scenic trails. The closure mostly impacts through hikers, a small group of plucky hikers who spend months walking across California, Oregon, and Washington before arriving at the U.S.-Canada border. The closure means through hikers must turn around at Monument 78, a small obelisk that marks the international boundary, which you see here in this slide. The nearest trailhead accessible by road is about 30 miles south of the border at Hart's Pass. In the past, through hikers could apply for a permit from Canada that allowed them to walk across the border and continue 8 miles to Manning Park on Highway 3 in British Columbia. From there, it was an easy bus ride into Vancouver. 2025 is not the first time the Canadian border has been closed to PCT hikers. Entry into Canada via the trail was paused for 3 years from 2020 until 2023 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. It turns out the pandemic was a rehearsal. News of the 2025 closure circulated quickly in the hiking community, provoking a range of emotions from confusion to anger to sympathy. A Reddit post was quickly locked, averting a deluge of comments. A moderator of the PCT Washington Facebook group shared the news along with a reminder, quote, Rule 3 states that we don't discuss politics here, tempting as it may be. Tempting indeed. The Pacific Crest Trail is political in every sense of the word, and over the course of this fellowship, I have come to believe that even more. I've spent a lot of time, there's some time working in the archives at the Huntington Library in Pasadena, looking at the papers of the founders of the trail and the ways in which the trail, sort of its origins, its original vision was wrapped up in Bush Depression era and then Cold War era. Geopolitics is really, really fascinating. And so I've always sort of thought of the trail as political, but I think the result of this research, I have a much deeper understanding and belief in understanding those origins. So thus keeping politics off the trail and out of conversations about it is an uphill battle. Cultivating an apolitical trail reinforces the idea that the trail is out there, somehow separate from society. This draws on old ideas about wilderness as pristine and uninhabited. I get the sentiment, and sometimes I share the desire to simply get away and leave politics behind, if only for a few days. But pretending the trail isn't political and trying to keep politics from intruding in our conversation about it limits our imaginations about what can be accomplished through trails and walking. January 8th, 2025, just over 1 year ago, Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum stood beside a 1607 map and proposed only half jokingly a new name for North America. Why don't we call it Mexican America? It sounds nice, right? The hastily called press conference was in response to Trump's audacious proposal floated the previous day to rename the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. The threat was not idle. Trump has since followed through. On January 20th, of last year, he signed Executive Order 14172 entitled Restoring Names That Honor American Greatness. Doubling down and escalating his go-to moves, Trump proclaimed February 9th as Gulf of America Day, forced compliance from Google Maps and other corporations, and barred the Associated Press from the Oval Office for non-compliance. Unlike the Gulf of America, Mexican America has a basis in historical fact. At the beginning of the Mexican-American War in 1846, much of the land that now comprises the western United States was part of northern Mexico. The present-day U.S. states of California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, the western part of New Mexico, a portion of Colorado, and a small part of Wyoming were all part of Mexican territory prior to the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war. The 1853 Gadsden Purchase transferred additional land in southern Arizona and New Mexico to the expanding United States. Just last week, on February 2nd, the White House issued a statement marking the 178th anniversary of the end of the Mexican-American War. Trump gloated about our nation's triumph and the legendary victory that secured the American Southwest, reasserted American sovereignty, and expanded the promise of independence across our majestic continent. Trump went on to tout his defense of our southern border against invasion and reasserted the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. In response, President Sheinbaum simply stated, "We must always defend our sovereignty." Stanford historian Albert Camarillo was more candid, describing Trump's statement as a distorted, ahistorical, imperialist version of the war. And just last night, Bad Bunny had something to say. So what does this mean for the Pacific Crest Trail? It means that what is today the California section of the PCT at 1,700 miles, the longest of the three states, would have been the Mexican section of the trail if it had existed from 1821 to 1848. And for roughly 50 years prior, beginning in 1769, when Spanish soldiers and priests established a Presidio and Mission Church at San Diego, it would have been part of the Spanish section. It means the borders Trump is so obsessed with fortifying are unstable. Tellingly, Trump has not threatened to make Mexico the 52nd state, but that's another story. The Pacific Crest Trail is defined by international borders. Mexico to Canada, border to border. These mantras propel hikers across vast distances. Author Robert Moore describes trails as stories. The trail is a story we tell ourselves about why we're following a certain route and why we're taking that journey, he writes. It's what gives the journey its significance in some sense. It's the kind of myth we tell ourselves. Beginnings and endings are, of course, fundamental parts of any story, and if the PCT is a story, it is one that begins and ends at the border. The photo of a sort of rite of passage for through hikers sticking a foot into Mexico, or now with the new fence and an arm into Mexico. These borders as both physical endpoints and narrative frames have become naturalized, fixed in space and time, and largely taken for granted. But if the PCT is a story, it's worth revisiting the question of where that story begins and ends and how the trail is framed. And it's also worth considering what is lost when we allow the story to be restricted by the international boundaries. After all, these boundaries are political creations, not natural features. They have histories. They've shifted over time, and they are not the only borders. The Pacific Crest Trail can be mapped, for example, onto a different set of international borders. The trail stretches roughly from Camp Alcume Nation in the south to Colville Nation in the north, between which it passes through the territory of more than 60 other indigenous nations. Emphasizing indigenous land explodes the frame. Border to border becomes borders within borders. Mexico to Canada becomes Campo to Colville or something else altogether. Today in Washington, a short section of the PCT passes through the Yakima Reservation. In Central Oregon, the trail passes through the Warm Springs Reservation. Hikers cross the border between the reservation and Mount Hood National Forest a handful of times over a 20-mile stretch of trail. The precise location of this boundary is contested and has shifted since 1855 when the treaty with the tribes of Middle Oregon was signed and the reservation was established. In 1972, a century-long dispute over the so-called McQuinn Strip was resolved in favor of the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, who claimed the northern and western boundaries of their reservation were based on a faulty 1871 land survey. Public Law 92427, passed by Congress in 1972, transferred almost 62,000 acres of public land from the Mount Hood and Willamette National Forest back to the tribes. This is an important and early example of land back. One of a handful along that PCT corridor. There's another one on the Yakima Reservation in Washington from that same period. Much of the PCT that passes through the reservation lies within the former McQuinn Strip. When this section of trail was constructed in the 1960s, it was located just outside the reservation, intentionally routed to avoid entering tribal lands. Zooming back out, the more familiar set of international borders are, like all borders, dynamic. They too were established through treaties and have since shifted, crossing peoples and places in the process. The contemporary boundary between the United States and Canada, for example, was established, finally sort of this last little bit, finalized in 1871 after the so-called Pig War in the San Juan Islands. In the grand scheme of things, the recent border closure is a minor inconvenience to northbound hikers, but it offers us all valuable lessons about the physical and symbolic contingencies of the trail. And it invites us to consider how closing and fortifying physical borders affects our patterns of thought and capacities of imagination. If the PCT is a kind of myth we tell ourselves, borders are an integral part of that myth. The US-Mexico border historian Greg Grandin writes, "It is America's new myth, a monument to the final closing of the frontier. It is a symbol of a nation that used to believe that it had escaped history, or at least strode atop history, but now finds itself trapped by history, and of a people who used to think that they were captains of the future, but now are prisoners of the past." To further complicate matters, the border isn't just a line where one country ends and another begins. It's a zone of federal police jurisdiction. To be precise, in the US, it's a 100-mile zone in which Customs and Border Protection exercises unusual power. The exact distance of the border zone, 100 miles from all international land borders and coastlines, was established by the Department of Justice in 1947. Nearly 2 out of 3 people, 200 million Americans, live within the 100-mile border zone, and all of Massachusetts, as you can see on this, barely see on this map, is within that zone. The U.S. Supreme Court, in a series of decisions in the 1970s, prioritized immigration enforcement over Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures. This means that in practice, anyone traveling in vehicles and vessels within the zone can be racially profiled, stopped, and searched without a judicial warrant. The Pacific Crest Trail is 2,650 miles long. Although the trail technically begins and ends at the border zone encompasses 64% of the trail, or 1,700 miles. Mexico to Canada takes on a different tenor when we think in terms of zones, not lines. Northbound hikers don't leave the border zone until mile 620, about the time they enter the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Southbounders don't leave the zone until they've hiked 686 miles from the Canadian border. The implications of the expanded border are serious, especially for non-white hikers. The zone also calls into question what it means to close the border, as happened last year. And without going into detail, I'll just say that a series of Supreme Court decisions in the 1970s that shaped these rights or limited these rights were based on cases in Southern California near the PCT corridor. So I'm also sort of interested in places like Scissors Crossing, where you can sort of see the trail as legal landscape and see ways in which it has shaped policy that's affecting hundreds of millions of people today. So I'm going to try and wrap up here in about a minute and a half. The northern and southern terminus of the PCT could not be more different. Located in the rugged North Cascades Mountains, the northern terminus is surrounded by cedar, fir, and larch. Situated on the edge of the Sonoran Desert, the southern terminus is surrounded by chaparral and scrub oak. However, the northern and southern terminus both feature identical monuments erected and maintained by the Pacific Crest Trail Association in cooperation with the U.S. Forest Service. One way the Instagram effect manifests on the PCT is through the now ubiquitous mirrored border monument selfies like these. The U.S.-Canada border is also marked with a small obelisk, Monument 78, one of hundreds installed by the International Boundary Commission along the world's longest undefended border at 5,525 miles. Although the border is now officially closed, it remains physically possible to walk across it. In other words, there's no fence or wall. In contrast, it's physically impossible now to walk across the U.S.-Mexico border. You need a tall ladder to scale the wall that now separates the two countries. In 2016, the PCTA erected a new Southern Terminus monument. The old one, a collection of 5 wooden posts, was rotting. It was originally installed in 1988 to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the National Trails System Act. The new monument was almost identical to the old one except for its position. The old monument was positioned such that the rusty border fence appeared in the background of otherwise celebratory photos of hikers embarking on journeys of a lifetime. This obligatory photo op involves sitting on or standing atop the monument and gesturing with great enthusiasm, or not, just standing next to it. When the new Southern Terminus monument was installed, it was pivoted, rotated 90 degrees so that the border fence wouldn't dominate the frame, in theory. This became even more of an issue in 2018 when the low fence was upgraded to a high wall. In our Instagram era, the fence or wall is an interloper or photo bomber, emphatically reminding us that the PCT is indeed political. To keep politics outside the photographic frame is analogous to keeping it out of the discussion forum. And yet politics is a way of asserting itself despite our efforts. Ironies abound along the southern border of the PCT. A wall meant to keep out unwelcome intruders itself became an unwelcome intruder. Caching water in the desert can be construed as an act of trail magic or a treasonous crime, depending on the intended audience. The border wall is a kind of monument too, an appropriate one to mark the southern terminus of the political PCT. But perhaps it's fitting that the monument is now less accessible. On December 10th of 2025, the Trump administration announced the establishment of a national defense area along much of the U.S.-Mexico border through California. The Department of the Interior is transferring 760 acres of public land to the U.S. Navy for a 3-year period to support ongoing border security operations. The southern terminus of the PCT is located within this national defense area. At this time, it's unclear how the NDA will impact hikers, although it's safe to assume it will impact them unevenly. Mexico to Canada, border to border. The meanings of these mantras have changed irrevocably over the past year. Today, to be honest, it feels more appropriate to say America, militarized border to a militarized border. Yet it also feels more urgent than ever to say this is indigenous land. No one is illegal on stolen land. And for me, the PCT is a useful framework to grapple with this idea in a very concrete way and to reorganize this space. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. That was awesome. Yeah, so at this point, we can just take questions. So if you're online, you can jump in or a few questions in the room, whatever you want to do.
Thank you all three. Sophie and Nick, these were fantastic presentations and congratulations on all the work you've already done. I have a question for Nick. I mean, I'm still just mulling over, but I'm curious to know whether the National Park Services have, like, through signage and other ways, like, shown the political dimension that you highlighted so well in your talk. And I'm also curious about hikers' positioning with respect to those issues?
Yeah.
Say it very vaguely.
Yeah. Yeah, and short answer is the sort of political spectrum of hikers is incredibly diverse. And so saying that the trail is political is sure to start. Like, there's a reason people try and shut down the Facebook groups because they very quickly like. But and in response to the other question, yeah, the parks up and down the trail have been doing a lot of really difficult work over the last decade in particular to try and tell more honest stories about their past and about their present and future too. And that is all changing right now. And so I have been following news, and the longer version of this gets into that a little bit, but news from Yosemite and news from North Cascades and news from pretty much, I was just reading a story about Death Valley National Park, which is off the trail, but in the corridor, and they are taking things down, just like the park in Philly that was telling more honest stories about the history of slavery. So yeah, it's like a really interesting moment right now, but the resistance is also like, so they're taking these things down, but the stories aren't disappearing, and how they are resurfacing and how they are being told. It's like something that I'm very interested in, but and also very certain that they will continue to be told. So.
Thanks for that. So I think the next question that we have is from Jeremy. Sophie, it's for you. It's in the chat.
Do you
Yeah,
have an
I
alternative? Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, so I think it's something I think about a lot. I think to some extent a level of management will always be inevitable, at least for some time, because we live in a world that's dominated by quantifiable things that we can control. I think my first response is that the first step is to manage humans to the same extent we manage nature. I think when we're tackling the ecological crisis, we typically see, okay, well, how can we manage the problem? How can we manage species invasion? How can we manage this so we get populations back up to a level they previously were? We don't think, how can we manage how we're using these resources, or how can we manage exploitation in a way that fundamentally changes the root cause? So I think that if management remains, which I think it will, there should be more equitable management. And by that, I mean management of people as well as nature, to the extent that we're separate. But I also think it's a question of framing. I think this problem is framed in terms of conservation management. And I think something as simple as changing that framing. I think management implies someone doing the managing and managing something unruly. And I think even something as simple as that sort of syntactic change will make quite a big difference in how this is presented and start to redistribute that hierarchy that we are in a position to control something which decades of research has shown we cannot control.
That's great. Yeah, we have another question in the chat from Nick. Nick, are you able to read that, or?
Yeah, from Cassandra. Yeah. I mean, I guess I don't feel the burden of having not to be like I sort of approach this project more out of a American Studies, Native Indigenous Studies, and critical art framework, and so the concern about being presentist isn't. It's not to say that it doesn't matter to me, but it's not something that I'm like worried about avoiding. I might if I were working as a historian on this project. Short answer.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I just had a thought for the idea of managing people versus managing nature. And in terms of the concept of unsettling, what has been more destabilizing? Neoliberalism giving complete and utter liberty to people and corporations, or from the other perspective, government intervention that seems to have destabilized a state of nature?
Or are they kind of the same thing?
Is that a question for me? Yes, I think so. I mean, it's a fair point, but I think that there's been less, sure, early on, government intervention was more destabilizing because the intervention in the sort of early 20th century was very much, well, I mean, it moved from pure exploitation to preservation, the idea that the natural wilderness should be in a state completely removed from any human intervention, which I don't think it should be one extreme or the other. I think there's a state where we can live in harmony, and that's the point. But I think currently there's far less action and far less management of people and how they interact with the natural world. And by people, I also more mean corporations. I'm talking about people in the broad and sense of what people can do. But I think, I guess, to the point of presentism, if we're looking at right now, I think what's more damaging is the lack of management of people's actions than the alternative.
And then Judith, there's a question for you in the chat from Lori. Oh, you're on mute.
Should I read the question?
It's fine. You can.
Okay.
You can...
So basically, I would say there is not as much. When I was at one point, I had the opportunity to visit New Zealand for about 6 weeks and went to the School for the Deaf there. And the Maori have a much stronger relationship between the deaf community and the hearing community than I think we do in the Native American communities here. They're very excited about, they want to talk to me a lot about the Native American deaf community and their engagement with, but I found that of course it's so different with, depending on which tribe you're talking about. But as far as I know, and you could probably know but more about this than I do, the Plains Indian Sign Language is more for communication outside the group with other indigenous nations, and more than it is an internal communication device for in other words, they don't for just Plains Indians. So I'm not sure of many links between those. There's a very strong link in the Maori culture between sign language and the Maori identity. The School for the Deaf in New Zealand, as you probably know, has a Maori compound that is led by Maori deaf adults. That is the residential school on the residential school of the larger. And in my limited experience, that's the most developed indigenous group that I have seen in terms of the deaf indigenous group relating to the rest of the deaf community of that particular nation.
Well, thanks for that, Judith. We're out of time, so I just wanted to take an opportunity to thank you, Judith, Sophie, and Nick. By me and giving them a round of applause. Thanks for everyone online as well. This was awesome. So see you for the next one.
The 23rd.
23rd. Yes.